Today's panel titled Rebuilding Trust in CeFi. It's a pretty tall ask, to be honest, after a string of failures last year of big centralized crypto players from FTX to Celsius, BlockFi, Voyager, and obviously, nerviness around Coinbase, Binance last year that we saw, and, failures in traditional finance of SVB, Silvergate, Signature. I just read a quote the other day. Andreessen Horowitz, A16Z, put it unequivocally: decentralization is crypto's defining promise. Networks that have no single point of failure are more secure and more resilient than their centralized counterparts. And that is why today's conversation is so fascinating, is because there's a counter narrative here. Several of the panelists here are believers that centralized firms do have a very important role to play in the crypto ecosystem, with key advantages in certain respects over decentralized alternatives. So let's get right into it. We've got Ken Berkowitz, head of product and co-founder at Souq, which is building a portfolio manager of Web3 game assets. I think I got that from your website. Okay, I was talking to JP, your founder. He gave me the latest elevator pitch. But okay, we've got Himanshu, CTO of Arch Lending. Thank you for joining us, Himanshu. We've got Sean Judge, partner at crypto investment firm Castle Island Ventures, and was an investor in BlockFi, right? So some firsthand experience. And we've got Agustin Lebron, CTO of Proven, whose name combines the Emperor Augustine with LeBron James.
Yeah.
So.
I've got them all covered.
All right. So, Sean, the first one goes to you. In an industry, crypto glorifying the principle of decentralization in some ways, why are we even talking about CeFi?
Well, the reality is that everybody that interacts with public blockchains in this country likely have been onboarded by a centralized institution. So Coinbase, probably more than anybody else in this country. And so you have these on-ramps where you need to get people into the ecosystem. And so if you're thinking about either retail or institutional adoption, you need to have centralized financial market infrastructure to start, because you need to have data and analytics companies to help these institutions understand what these crypto assets are doing. You need to have trade execution services, custodians that they can trust, that meet regulatory requirements. I think the goal of a future where everything is peer-to-peer and there's full decentralization is an exciting one to think about. But for the short to medium term, there's going to need to be centralized financial market infrastructure that exists.
That's great. Thank you, Sean. And Himanshu, next one for you. Maybe just to turn it around, DeFi, decentralized, maybe what are some of the deficiencies there that centralized might solve?
I think we're not at a point in this country and in the world today where we have the regulation to really operate DeFi securely. I think in centralized markets, we have a regulatory framework that prevent a lot of the issues in DeFi, such as the risk of counterparty hacks. We have in the US, at least, we have a central reserve that backstops banks, which we don't have in DeFi, which is why we see a lot of companies that go under, not able to recoup funds for any of their customers. Also in DeFi, we have a lot of issues like not being able to interact across multiple assets. So you are stuck to the silo of the ecosystem you're in, whether that's in Ether or in one of the L2s that are coming up now. And then you also don't have a easy customer experience today. In CeFi, we have a very easy way to interact for the 99%. If you are a DeFi degen and you are comfortable interacting with DeFi, that might be okay, but that's not the case for most people today. So there's a lot of UX that needs to come in, and also the regulation needs to catch up so we can use it in a safe and secure manner.
And Ken, just going to you, Ken. I mean, your platform is more toward decentralization, right? I mean, maybe if you have any thoughts in your mind of what sorts of things might go decentralized versus stay centralized or go centralized.
Yeah, I mean, I think long term, like Sean was talking about, this we're a ways away from everything being able to operate efficiently in a decentralized manner. I think that the reality is that most people who have traded assets, whether in TradFi or in crypto, are used to a centralized experience. That's kind of what we have interacted with in traditional brokerages, trading stocks, that types of thing. And so I think the fact that not only do you have to come through a centralized entity in order to get into DeFi, but you're also used to this centralized experience of being able to access all of these different opportunities and assets through a single platform. I do think that there's kind of a critical role from a distribution perspective that centralized platforms can play. But I ultimately do think that the most innovation will happen in DeFi products. And if CeFi can be a nice pathway, allowing people to seamlessly access all of those, then it's kind of a win-win. And I think they can be symbiotic.
Augustine, do you see that, the centralized players remaining kind of the primary on-ramps?
Yeah, certainly. I think in over the next kind of short to medium term, that has to be the case for all the reasons that were already stated. I think one of the things that we have to focus on is, given that that's the case, what can we do in order to really sort of trust it, right? And I think the watchword is sort of trust but verify, where the DeFi dream of living in a fully trustless society, I think, like you guys said, maybe it's down the road, but for the time being, it is certainly the case that we're going to have to trust intermediaries, financial intermediaries. And so the question is, given that that's the case, what can we do in order to make that trust process a little bit more scalable, organic, all these things that are important?
Just sticking with you for a second here, Augustine, clearly there's the entrepreneurs in this industry who are starting companies and developing technologies. And then there's the regulators and, maybe playing a pretty active hand in designing what the market's going to look like. What is, maybe the answer is obvious here, but maybe not. What do regulators want in terms of CeFi versus DeFi?
Yeah, I think if they knew that, then maybe we could have a shot at knowing that, but I don't think they do, to be honest. And look, and I think that's just a fact about any large entity, and the U.S. government is among the largest, is there's lots of little players, there's lots of little fiefdoms, there's lots of little areas that are competing. And so I think as an industry, the thing we have to do is identify those players within the government or within all these regulatory industries or agencies that sort of have a vision that is compatible with what we want to do and build relationships with them. I think if we can get those people to be successful in their internal knife fights, then I think we have a decent shot.
Sean, over to you. Specifically on some of the AML, KYC stuff, is that always going to be better in a CeFi world than a DeFi world, or do you think DeFi can get there?
There are solutions on the side that are being built right now. Over the last 3-4 months, but in terms of like onboarding a retail user in a centralized exchange, which is kind of what the experience is for 99% of people today. You're still going to need these kind of centralized compliance software companies that are selling into these exchanges and financial institutions to do all that stuff.
Himanshu, I think you were probably the intellectual architect of putting this panel together based on our conversations. And I mean, just putting you the main question, how do we rebuild trust in the CeFi space?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand what happened last year first off, and then see what we can do to fix it. So we saw a lot of cowboying work outside of regulatory frameworks and fraudulent activity, right? So I think the idea of trust but verify is quite important, but also the idea of just building trust through working within regulation is very important as well. So I think the US government has a role to play here, and they need to be clear on what the stance is, but also companies need to be sure about not rehypothecating assets, about using qualified custodians, and about being able to prove financially that they are who they say they are and what they're doing with their assets.
And Augustine, let's go to you. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about Proven and how your company works and how it is addressing this issue.
Yeah, so what we've built is a system that allows centralized exchanges and any other financial intermediary to prove their solvency on a daily basis in a zero-knowledge way, so that they don't reveal any of the kind of sensitive information that they quite reasonably would want to be kept private, and that has historically prevented them from doing these sorts of proofs of solvency. And so this is kind of a new technology that allows these intermediaries to really prove solvency in a way that's cryptographically secure, while still, again, keeping that privacy that they need.
And just, to throw this in there, you and I had a funny exchange when we had a little pre-interview. the concept of fraud, and you have all these systems, and how is there any way to end fraud?
So yeah, I think it's a belt and suspenders thing, and I'll be honest that this is a personal issue for me. I was one of the people at Jane Street that hired Sam, and so this hurts. It hurts in so many ways, and so yeah, like it's not going to be one magic bullet that's going to do the trick. It's going to be a long set of different approaches, different solutions to the problem that's going to get us there, just like in TradFi.
Ken, in your mind, what are some of the things that CeFi can do to rebuild trust?
I actually think that there is an opportunity to explore kind of like hybridization of building in potentially some smart contract enforced trust within centralized entities. I think it definitely, like, there's some interesting opportunities, I think, to have permissions built in where centralized entities can't take certain actions with consumer funds, but they can only do a very specific set. I think that DeFi as an ecosystem has shown a pretty good ability to kind of organize and regulate itself in some ways, better in some ways than others. But I think that we, like, in the absence of government regulators working quickly enough, I think we've all seen what happened with FTX and others. I think it's pretty obvious how customer funds can and can't be allocated responsibly with and without their permission. And using smart contract infrastructure, I think, to be able to kind of build that ourselves in the meantime, before we have more guidance, I guess, from countries, might be a useful thing to look into.
I mean, in other words, going back to what Agustin was talking about, is that doing it that way with some kind of smart contracts within the CeFi framework is better than just laws, for example, on how to do things?
I mean, I think it's I don't think lawmakers would say yes, but I think that we as a community probably have been through enough pain from centralized exchanges that we understand like the main vectors for failure and can probably set a pretty simple set of rules that could stop these things from happening in the future.
Himanshu, in your mind, sexes, are they a permanent fixture of the crypto landscape, or again, is it just they have a certain time where they will be relevant?
Well, I think a centralized exchange is just another example of a centralized entity. But I think what's important to understand is this world where your centralized your identity is not revealed and there is no central authority that regulates what happens is a very far world, and that doesn't exist today, and I don't think it will exist for a while. So yes, they are here to stay for as long as I can see. And I think this idea of combining your identity in the DeFi world and the CeFi world is going to happen first. And I think regulation is going to catch up, because at the end of the day, if these are securities that we are trading, then there will be a government authority that comes in and regulates it. So I think the regulation is going to catch up first, and that will dictate what happens next.
And that's going to be pretty fascinating, right? I mean, how does that play out? We've seen a lot of these suits where, the SEC will sort of indirectly name a crypto as a security, and then, oh, wait, this other exchange is listing that same thing. So how does that play out?
Well, I think we need clarity. We don't have any clarity. If you look at the conversation around staking, for example, in the past few months, we've seen the SEC say that you can stake, and then we've seen them say that you can't stake for XYZ reason.
Right.
And then we've seen them only regulate a couple of entities on that front, Kraken and Coinbase to name a couple. But I think there's more clarity needed. I think Sean has an interesting take on this.
Yeah, I mean, there's very clearly like a bit of a turf war going on between the CFTC and the SEC. You have the SEC that's calling Ethereum a security, you have the CFTC that's saying it's not, and so it's a bit of a mess. And I think that it's going to take an act of Congress. There's market structure and stablecoin bills that are being discussed right now. I think the likelihood of either of them passing is fairly low, but hopefully at some point we can figure out what is the appropriate path for token launches in this country, what kind of safe harbors do existing projects have in the country, what should be regulated by the SEC, what should be regulated by the CFTC, and then we'll have to take it from there. Because if these are securities, all of these exchanges are going to have to either delist them or become ATS venues, which is a whole other ballgame.
Just, in terms of thinking into the future, and, obviously Wall Street is a very, very centralized world, and crypto, there's this ethos of decentralization, but very key players that are centralized. Who wins in a future, world of sort of hybrid decentralized, and centralized? Is it going to be the Wall Street centralized players or the crypto native centralized players?
Very much TBD. I would say in general, success for crypto has to look like integration into the existing financial system. It's not replacement, it's integration. And so who wins out of that integration process? The market will decide, the world will decide. But I think that's maybe the vision that I think we have to work towards.
Ken, maybe just to go to you, the just the propaganda and kind of the war of words of the competing concepts of DeFi versus CeFi. Again, we're here at this panel and discussing restoring trust in CeFi. I mean, do you have any thoughts on what CeFi needs to rebrand?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think in terms of a rebrand from CeFi, it takes time, I think, often to just heal wounds, right? And so from that perspective, I don't think there's anything that can be immediately done. But I think a long-term kind of education in terms of, you have to first build the things that enable rebuilding of trust. And then I think from there, you just kind of have to probably get some big partnerships and things like that to really absorb other people's trust. Because I think that's kind of how trust tends to diffuse throughout an ecosystem. You have certain big players who have the trust of a lot of people that might follow them or be influenced by them. And through those people kind of giving the check mark on something, the people below who kind of follow what they do, I think will fall in line as well.
I think on that, there's obviously at some point it will be regulatory clarity, but the industry as a whole needs to self-police. And I think these are two marquee examples of our ability to do that within centralized finance. Proven is going to allow for FTX hopefully never to happen again, because people will be able to verify a proof of reserves on the platform. And with Arch, I think BlockFi did a lot of really interesting things, right? It was a painful lesson. I don't think consumers necessarily understood that when they were getting 6 to 8% on their Bitcoin, that it was being rehypothecated out. Now all those retail users understand that. But I think the next 100 million, the next billion users that interact with a lender, and if they're getting yield or not, will understand, in Arch's case, that this is not being rehypothecated. They're not lending out your assets when you're borrowing against it. So I think those are two examples of hopefully lessons in terms of rebuilding trust in the industry.
I mean, it's kind of interesting to think about how the proposed solutions for CeFi rebuilding in the crypto world are, no rehypothecation, proof of reserves. You hold it, you take your customer assets and you keep it there, as opposed to in the traditional financial world where they do this like crazy in fractional reserve banking, and it's all backed by the Federal Reserve. I mean, I'm just curious, would that be a solution for some of these CeFi firms in crypto, is to figure out a way to just get plugged into the Fed, right? I mean,
the United States government has a monopoly on violence in this country, and that goes a long way, right? The ability they have to charge for your taxes is kind of an important thing. I don't see that kind of a large player ever showing up in crypto, hopefully, I would say. So I think, it's just fundamentally different.
Himanshu, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the fractional reserve system is a US concept. And with crypto being global, I don't see a fractional reserve in crypto on a global scale today. If that happens in the US, we could see US-based players get a big benefit from that, because they'd have the Fed backstopping them. It'll come with a ton of regulation, though. And I think it'll start looking like well, it will give a big leg up to CeFi players that operate in the US within regulation. And I do think there is some level of interest in something like that with the recent failures in the past year. So we'll see what happens. But if that does happen, it'll be good for US players, bad for crypto as a whole, I think.
Interesting. Yeah. All right. This is going to be our last question. This one's going to you, Sean. Just kind of looking into the future, and in your job, you talk to a lot of founders and a lot of people who are startup, executives who are looking to build stuff. And I'm curious, is there any particular solution or company you've come across in your travels that you think is something that we should all be thinking about?
Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff. I mean, there's a lot of different opportunities right now in the stablecoin space. I think we're seeing more companies being started that are looking at what happened over the last year and saying, how do we right the ship here, and how do we improve trust with some of these centralized players? Things like Proven would be a perfect example of that. So the entrepreneurial ecosystem is still vibrant, and I think people are looking to tackle real world solutions here.
Thank you.